Before I begin my talk, I'm going to make an overarching comment for all of your organizations, and that is that I'm going to assume that your board is a strategic governance board and that operations belong to management under the leadership of the executive director or CEO. And with that said, let's also assume that the strategic plan is set by the board but is shared and upheld by the entire organization. So with that assumption, let's get to good idea number one. Your budget lives in the house of the strategic plan. Build it from the ground up, tend to it line by line, and keep your windows wide open. Your budget lives in the house of the strategic plan, which is to say that the container of the budget, the house, if you will, is full of ideas and directions. The strategic plan is the blueprint that the house is built on, and every blueprint needs to be fully costed. That is where the budget comes in. And the budget is costed out not by the people who set the strategic plan, but by the people who ultimately build it. And that is by the ground up. The front line of the organization, the people on the ground, those people who are ultimately responsible for carrying out the goals and objectives of your organization, they are the team watching and listening who will know what you need to include in your budget. So keep your eyes and ears open so that you will know who and what to pay attention to. And if you're a social service agency, those are the counselors, the employment workers, the housing workers. They are the bookkeeping and administrative staff. They are the fundraising staff. They're the people who know what it takes to run an agency, and they need to have a say in the budget. And they may have a say directly, through a meeting organized for the purpose of getting their input, or if your management staff is really watching and listening, then they're having their input seen and heard every day when they report to management about what is happening. Perhaps the Teen Mothers program that you serve is getting more teen moms, and maybe those moms and their kids are showing up hungrier than they have ever been. In that case, the manager will find a way to get more snacks into the budget, or let the fundraising team know that they should be soliciting more gift cards from donors. And the budget line for food expense goes up, and the budget line for fundraising gifts goes up. Or perhaps your counseling staff have been networking with other counseling organizations and learn of a training geared specifically for understanding the people you serve. Your staff want to take the training, but it costs more than you have budgeted this year. An informed budget, fed from and built by the ground up, will include these training costs in the following year's budget in order to stay responsive and on track with the organization's strategy to serve the people that you serve in the best way you can. Tend to it line by line. I'm personally a big believer in the quarterly projection, and you'll hear me refer to this in a few places in this talk, but let me start with it here. In the context of tending to the budget line by line, this literally means checking in with your budget line by line every quarter, or more often if you feel you should, and reviewing what is happening with each of those budget lines and why. Have hydro costs gone up? Is that why your hydro expenses are greater than your budget? Or can you review an electricity conservation program with the tenants you serve? If you don't pay attention to each line, and if you only focus on the bottom line, you may miss valuable insights. I've been in this business for a while, and numbers are funny things. Your bottom line might be only off by $100, but you should never miss the opportunity to see that there's a $100,000 variance one way and a $99,900 variance the other. It all comes out to $100, but in the meantime, you may never know that you saved all that money on benefit costs while your training costs skyrocketed. Finally, for this good idea, I'm suggesting that you keep your windows wide open. Of course, I'm speaking in metaphors here, but to me, the open window suggests opportunity, and we have to stay open to opportunity always. Keep your windows open so that you hear what your neighbors are saying. Network with agencies like yours. Keep your windows open so that you can hear of funding opportunities. And of course, keep keep your windows open so that you can let the fresh air and sunshine in. That will help the plants grow, and that's just good for everyone. Good idea number 2. Make sure your fundraising targets are realistic. Zero-based budgeting can be overrated. Facing a deficit head-on might just be better than relying on a fundraising plug. The key here is to understand what your fundraising targets are and where they come from. If your budget magically balances to zero, then you need to zero in on the fundraising number. How high is it? Has it gone up since the prior year? Is that realistic? Are there notes that outline exactly how that fundraising number was derived? And more importantly, how it will be achieved? Have you seen a trend line? Are your fundraising numbers growing or declining over the years? Have you had a past history of realizing your fundraising targets? Do you budget too high or even too low? Fundraising dollars are tricky because they usually don't automatically come back year after year, although I'm not a fundraiser by profession and I am prepared to be argued out of that statement. What I do know from what I've seen is that a lot of work goes into getting those fundraising dollars. Why do people give money to an organization? Because they were asked. And so we need to ask and ask again and again. Sometimes our donors keep giving, but sometimes a new charity comes along and our donors give their dollars to the new charity. The point is, what are the plans for the hard work that will be done to get those dollars? And in your mind, do those plans seem realistic and, more importantly, attainable? So what happens if you poke away at the fundraising plans and the fundraising targets, and that, in fact, they are a plug? That is, they are the exact amount required by the organization to keep you from having a budget deficit. What do you do then? My advice? Take the deficit. If you are management presenting the budget, then at least you are taking a realistic picture to the board. Some organizations, while never wanting to have a deficit by year end, will budget for one in any event because they know that throughout the year, things change. Staff leave, and a replacement may not always be hired in time. New funding dollars come, and sadly, new funding dollars go. The budget is the organization's best estimate at a moment in time of the picture for the year that lies ahead. And if you are a board member receiving a deficit budget, the first thing to do is check on the reserves of the organization. The reserves are found on the balance sheet. They may be called net assets or accumulated surplus. The City of Toronto sets general guidelines that say that organizations should have between 1 and 3 months of operating dollars in reserves at all times. So, when presented with a deficit budget, get out your calculator. Divide your budget into 12, multiply that by 3. If the deficit you are approving keeps your reserves right in that sweet spot between 1 and 3 months of operation, then you may feel comfortable approving it. If not, sharpen your pencils and find ways to reduce the deficit, but don't count on it necessarily coming from fundraising. Let me say a word about zero-based budgeting. I know there are some agencies and some boards who on principle would never approve a budget that wasn't zero-based. That is, when revenues equal the exact amount of expenditures. I'm fine with that and respect that principle. Frankly, as a director of finance, it's a lot more comforting to manage a zero-based budget than a deficit one. But at the risk of repeating myself, just ensure that all your revenue targets are realistic. Otherwise, you may end up with not just a deficit budget, but an actual deficit, which is far worse. For us in the nonprofit world, our job is difficult. In the for-profit world, all eyes shoot to the bottom line, and it's pretty straightforward. Bigger is always better. In the charity sector, we are measured not by profit, but by service. Our service is delivered by spending our budget. So our measurement is really, did we spend an appropriate amount to get the service delivered? Donors and funders don't give us dollars so that we can save them up and add them to our reserves. They give us dollars so that we can do the work we are meant to do, which means we must spend them. Our job is difficult because we have to try to get as close to zero, that is, all spent, without going over, that is, having a deficit. Good idea number 3. Ask any question. None is too small. When you're approving the budget, no question is too small and no idea is too big. This is my philosophy. If I put a financial report in your hand, then you are allowed to ask me any question about it. In fact, I welcome questions, and so too do my financial colleagues across the sector. I think we've been trained to be self-conscious, especially at board meetings, to not take up too much space, to not hold up the meeting, to go over time on the agenda. And for that reason, often important documents are presented and approved, and in fact may not have been discussed with the thoroughness that is warranted. So do speak out. Do ask your questions. None is too small, too picky, too irrelevant. A good question to ask often is, what are you expecting from me when you give me this report to approve? My answer would be, I am expecting you to review it and to ask anything about it that is not clear and to discuss the merits of it with your colleagues. A lot of work has gone into these reports, so in a way, it is a respectful act to take the time to review and discuss them. The budget is also a time for big ideas. There is certainly an opportunity at budget approval time to suggest your ideas for how the organization might grow or to plant the seeds of an idea that you may want to come back to throughout the year. Remember, the strategic plan is the blueprint, and the strategic plan might also have some big ideas. Make sure the budget reflects them. Sometimes big ideas can be situated within the budget as opportunities. That is, they aren't built into the detailed costing, but you are alert to the fact that there may be opportunities existing and that these will be pursued and added to the organization's future projections later on in the year or even in future years. For example, your budget this year may include the cost for a small delegation to travel to Quebec to learn firsthand how they have incorporated trauma-informed principles into their shelter work. The investment in this trip this year may result in future funding opportunities for future years. Still, it may be that you're not ready, even after hearing my encouraging words, to put up your hand, take up space, and ask your small question or present your big idea to the group. This doesn't mean that you should forget your small question or big idea. There should always be an opportunity to take the finance director aside and ask it of them one-on-one. And one last thing on this point, trust your gut. If something doesn't ring true in the budget, do make a note. Circle back around to it, whether in private or in public. Numbers require lots of eyes and lots of attention. If something doesn't add up in your gut, get out your calculator. You might find the numbers truly do not add up, and us accountants, we have all been there. It might be a little bit embarrassing to discover that we've made a mistake, but in the end, we will thank you. Good idea number 4. Pay attention to capital purchases. They can be tricky. They can eat up cash and put amortization costs into your budget for years. So let me say this, cash matters. And having said this, let me ask you, do you know how much cash is in your bank account? Where would you look for that number? One place you might look, but you will never find it, is in the budget report. And that's because the measurement of income and expenses, believe it or not, in the accounting world, is often wholly unrelated to cash. Cash in the bank is noted in one place, and that's on the balance sheet. So in general, before you approve the budget, it's always a good idea to ensure that someone is watching the budget in relation to the bank account. To take it to the extreme, you could have a budget showing revenues of $1 million and expenses of $800,000, leaving a $200,000 surplus for the budget year. And yet, when asked what the cash position is expected to be at year end, taking into account this $200,000 surplus, the finance director lets you know that the bank account balance is expected to be in an overdraft of $1 million. How can this be possible? First of all, there could be receivables in those revenue numbers that can't be collected for months. Secondly, the finance director reminds you the organization bought a property for $1 million and paid for it in cash until the funding comes in year 2. And now the bank balance is overdrawn and is expected to be so until a year and a half from now. Another important point about capital purchases is that they are unusual in terms of how they land on your budget. When you make your capital purchases, say you buy new couches for your shelter at a cost of $8,000. The first thing that happens is that you pay for the couches in cash or by check, but that is really the same thing because it comes from your bank account. That $8,000 doesn't appear on your budget. And that's because the theory is that the furniture will last for longer than a year. So it's a capital purchase. In your amortization policy, it states that furniture should be amortized over 8 years. Now, just to get technical, accounting rules say that in the year of purchase, you divide that number, called the amortization cost, in half, something called the half-year rule. So you spent $8,000, and $8,000 came out of your bank account. But your budget reflects an expense of $500 in year 1, $1,000 in years 2 through 8, and $500 in year 9. So you're going to buy it now, and the budget will pay later for the next 9 years. A good thing to keep in mind if you're asked to approve a capital purchase. And as I said, beware of capital purchases. A, make sure there's enough cash to buy them, and B, be aware of how long that expense will stick around. And finally, good idea number 5. You can always change your forecast, but the budget is the budget. You cannot budge it. I've said it before. In fact, I have said it before in a 5 Good Ideas talk. The budget is the budget is the budget. I say this for a number of reasons. One, and most importantly, you need one budget for your organization because that is the simplest thing. And the budget that you present to your funders is the same budget that your board approved and is the same budget you give to your bank when they are approving a line of credit. It is all one budget and it is the same. That's not to say that for certain funders, they only need to see that portion of your budget that pertains to them, especially if you're a multi-service, multi-funded agency. The Ministry of Community and Social Services, for example, which funds your shelters, does not expect to see the budget that you gave to the Trillium Foundation, for another example, which might be funding your employment programs. But each of those separate budgets should be rolled up into your one budget, and that is the budget that the board approves, and that is your one budget. And in terms of the board approving your budget, the board needs to have the confidence that the budget you gave them to approve just before the beginning of the upcoming year is the same budget that shows up on all the reports thereafter. They should be able to recognize the same line items with the same budgeted numbers. And yet things change all the time, especially in this exciting sector. You may have been approved for 17 new shelter beds with the related per diems, and this has spurred new hiring. You want to be able to reflect these new expenses and the corresponding funding in upcoming reports. As I said before, I'm a big believer in the quarterly projection. At my agency, YWCA Toronto, we revise our quarterly projections 3 times a year. We don't change the budget because the budget is the budget and we do not budge it, but we do sit with the program managers and review line by line how well their actuals are doing compared to their original budget and what might change as we move forward. And we present these revised quarterly projections, these quarterly numbers, as a quarterly projection to our board every quarter. That way, you can keep track of what's changing, but you always have your original budget there for reference. And that way, everyone's telling the same story, even if plots and characters are constantly changing, evolving, developing, and keeping all of us on our toes. Thank you.